My hometown, a hidden history of slavery, Jim Crow, and integration. I met my future wife, Sherry, while stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. To a young Army captain, she seemed brilliant and exotic, an investment banker from Manhattan. Neither my Southern Christian gentleman upbringing nor my Army officer training had prepared me for someone from the big city. I was smitten. She told me about how the recession had hit her boutique investment bank. She spoke a language I didn't understand: stocks, bonds, IPOs, Series 7 qualifications, and the Hamptons. What a different world from Fort Bragg. At 6 a.m. every morning, I braved the crush of cars on the All-American Freeway, carrying soldiers to PT at Fort Bragg. Physical training, 12-mile ruck marches, jumping out of C-130 airplanes, preparing for war. I was a captain in the 82nd Airborne Division, a Southern gentleman paratrooper sporting a maroon beret, the signature headgear of the airborne. I was cocky as hell. Sherry understood cocky. Her father, Colonel Ed Coggins, West Point class of 1953, spent his Air Force career flying jets, including 3 tours in Vietnam. If anyone is more cocky than a beret-wearing paratrooper, it's a fighter pilot. The Coggins clan hopscotched the globe during the long Cold War. Sherry attended 3 high schools in 4 years, graduating from Kaiserslautern American High School in Germany. She understood the military life because she lived it, but marrying a soldier meant moving every 2 years, upending her life. Plus, exchanging Manhattan for eastern North Carolina would be a tough sell. As we dated, I tried my best to interest her. I told her about myself, early life, college, Army. As she listened to my stories, she quickly understood that not only was I Southern, but I was aggressively Southern. Sherry has a sharp ear and a willingness to speak her mind. You say you're a Southern, but you were born in Alexandria, Virginia, a suburb of Washington, D.C. And, come on, that's really not the South. Georgia, sure. Alabama, of course. Mississippi, definitely. But Northern Virginia, Alexandria, that's not the South. Thus began our first argument. Of course it's Southern, I explained, red-faced. Alexandria was Robert E. Lee's hometown. He was raised 2 miles from my house, for goodness sake. Arlington was his home as an adult, and that's north of Alexandria. How could she possibly argue against Robert E. Lee? Okay, she said warily, but Alexandria is a part of Washington now, and it's hardly a Southern city. She gave me a nuanced and compelling argument, but I was still litigating the Civil War. My honor reeled from a perceived slight about my identity. If Alexandria wasn't Southern, then maybe I wasn't Southern. Sherry looked at me with worry. A question about a Washington suburb triggered an identity crisis in me. Was I sane? Why in heaven's name would I care so much? Why indeed? At the age of 26, I was more Southerner than Army officer, more Southerner possibly than American. I couldn't imagine describing myself as anything other than a Southern gentleman, except maybe a Virginia gentleman, a slightly higher caste. When my new girlfriend questioned my Southernness, my identity, I sulked. I knew I was raised in the South, despite Alexandria's proximity to D.C., but as a child, and even as a young adult, I didn't realize just how much Alexandria, at least my Alexandria, retained its white Southern roots. If I had known more about the history of my city, I might have convinced my future wife. I needed her to understand that I was Southern, but I now know that identity comes at a price. To be a Southern gentleman for me meant embracing one view of history, a skewed one that placed the Confederacy front and center and willfully excluded the racial history all around me. In Alexandria, I grew up between Quaker Lane and Braddock Road, just off King Street, inside the gates of Episcopal High School, a private boys' boarding school. We lived on campus and ate breakfast and dinner with the students. More than any other place, it created for me the ideal of the Southern Christian gentleman, steeped in Confederate lore. My dad was a history teacher and coached football and track at the high school. Founded in 1839, Episcopal was one of the oldest high schools in Virginia, hence its moniker of the high school. The students came from wealthy families who lived further south. I heard Episcopal called the northernmost Southern school. One graduate called it a citadel of Southern establishment patrimony. Like me, Episcopal was aggressively Southern with a mission to create educated Christian gentlemen. When I was growing up at Episcopal, the idea of a Virginia gentleman was omnipresent, the highest life form because of the link to the pantheon of true heroes. Several of my dad's students were direct descendants of Robert E. Lee, a fact everyone at the school knew. Lee represented the ultimate educated Christian gentleman. 100 years after the surrender at Appomattox, the Civil War, and especially reverence for all things Confederate, remained part of the high school's DNA. From 1870 to 1981, Episcopal High School's leader was either a Confederate veteran, a son of a veteran, or a grandson of a veteran with only one 20-year break. The headmaster from 1870 to 1913, Minor Blackford, served in Longstreet's corps. When he died, the school placed a Confederate battle flag on his coffin. His deputy headmaster, the Confederate Colonel Llewellyn Hoxton, West Point class of 1861, dedicated the Confederate Memorial in Alexandria. Hoxton's son Archibald served as headmaster for nearly 35 years and kept his dad's Confederate sword hanging in his office. His son, Archibald Hoxton Jr., graduated from Episcopal in 1935 and became headmaster in 1967. I remember him well. In some ways, the Confederate link was more than implicit. The high school etched in marble a list of 68 old boys who died in gray. I walked by that tablet dozens of times. Graduates who died wearing U.S. Army blue warranted no memorial. Historian Charles Reagan Wilson called Episcopal High School a lost cause denominational secondary school. Episcopal saw itself as part of old Virginia. If the country was a chessboard, Virginia was the White Queen, the most important state in the nation, the home of presidents. As a child, I memorized every president in order as a kind of parlor trick. My dad had given me 3-inch white figurines of each president, and I could perform on command, placing them in chronological order. Asked to choose my favorites, I picked, in order, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. 4 of the first 5 presidents were Virginians. I would never pick John Adams from Massachusetts. I knew more Virginia trivia. The American Revolution ended with American victory at Yorktown, in Virginia. The Old Dominion hosted more Civil War battles than any other state. First again. I knew that Virginia was so far and away the best, but a Virginian would never say that. Boasting? That was for Texans. One writer described the Virginia state of mind 5 years before I was born as a regal humility or a mystique rooted in instincts of graciousness, chivalry, generosity, and a benevolent aristocratic idealism, all attributes of the plantation society. The great Mississippi writer William Faulkner, who knew a thing or two about Southern identity, spent a year as a writer in residence at the University of Virginia in 1957. He returned to Charlottesville often to visit his daughter, who married a Virginia lawyer. Asked if he liked his stay, the Nobel laureate said, "I like Virginia, and I like Virginians, because Virginians are all snobs, and I like snobs. A snob has to spend so much time being a snob, he has little left to meddle with you. And so, it is very pleasant here." White Virginians even had a creed, one I believed fervently as a child. Today, the Virginia Creed is available on coffee mugs or dish towels at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. To be a Virginian, either by birth, marriage, adoption, or even on one's mother's side, is an introduction to any state in the Union, a passport to any foreign country, and a benediction from above. Virginia was the most important state in the South, and therefore the nation, but did my future wife have a point about Alexandria? Was its proximity to the nation's capital enough to make my hometown agnostic in the regional and cultural wars? When I first met her, I could only fulminate. But as a historian, I discovered that Alexandria has a thoroughly grotesque Southern story, a story that starts with the creation of Washington, D.C. Perhaps the most famous dinner in American history settled the question of where to put the new capital of the United States of America. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton dined at Thomas Jefferson's New York rental, 57 Maiden Lane, on June 20, 1790. Recently, the meeting became even more famous after Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton immortalized the dinner with the song "The Room Where It Happens." The new Constitution gave Congress the power to create a new seat of government, not to exceed 10 square miles. The idea of a permanent capital didn't appeal to all the delegates, but many remembered the Pennsylvania Mutiny of 1783, when a mob of soldiers descended on Philadelphia demanding back pay, forcing the Continental Congress to decamp the city. The mayor of Philadelphia refused to quash the uprising. The Constitutional Convention wanted to ensure the new government had complete control of the new city for their own safety, but where should they place the new capital? Like many of the nation's problems, the politics of the capital's location split regionally. Northerners wanted it closer to a big city like Philadelphia, and Southerners wanted it in a slaveholding region. If the capital's location was an issue, so too was the new nation's debt. Who would pay for the obligations from the Revolutionary War or the debts incurred by the United States since 1783, or the debts of the states? Alexander Hamilton wanted the new United States to assume all state debts, helping to create a stronger national government with the ability to borrow. Debt paid off by the federal government would also serve to stitch the states together. But there was a hitch. Many southern states, like Virginia and North Carolina, had paid off much of their debt already. If the debt was nationalized, they would pay more than their northern brothers and sisters. Madison also worried that a strong central government might not agree with their notions of property, or as we call it today, slavery. The Compromise of 1790, forged at Jefferson's dinner table, provided the answers to the capital's location and the national debt. This pact would be the first of three great compromises spaced exactly 30 years apart that kept the United States one nation. The Virginians, Madison and Jefferson, agreed to Hamilton's consolidation of state and federal debt under the new national government, while Hamilton gave Virginia extra money and agreed to a southern location for the new capital, situated between two slave states, Maryland and Virginia. In the summer of 1790, Congress passed the Residence Act, creating the nation's capital along the Potomac north of where it is today. Congress allowed the president to select the exact location, but President George Washington demanded that the new capital include his favored city of Alexandria, only 7 miles north of his Mount Vernon estate, but further south than Congress's law allowed. Washington forced Congress's hand, essentially coercing the new body to include Alexandria. Territory from Maryland and Virginia created a 10-mile square capital on either side of the Potomac River. Yet by the Civil War, Alexandria was no longer a part of the District of Columbia, and the founders' carefully crafted, diamond-shaped 100 square miles now looks roughly shorn, with the jagged Potomac as the western border. One later historian called the new district mutilated because it lost a third of its territory. The federal government, or any government, rarely gives back something it has previously taken, especially when different states initially competed to give property to create the capital. The story of how Alexandria went from a part of the District of Columbia back to Virginia reveals its racial history. In September 1846, white Alexandrians celebrated the results of a referendum to leave the District of Columbia and return to Virginia, a process called retrocession. After announcing the vote, 763 for retrocession and 222 against, the crowd exploded with the loudest cheers and a salvo from the artillery. Nothing like a cannonade to punctuate a celebration. Then, the young folks lighted torches and carried flags, banners, and transparencies, while firearms were discharged, rockets, squips, and crackers were let off, and general joy and enthusiasm prevailed. Finally, the crowd formed in procession and crossed the old line that used to divide us from Virginia, so they could fire upon the soil of our state a national salute of retrocession. Alexandrians literally turned south, placing their current allegiance and future with the Old Dominion. Not everyone in Alexandria was happy. When retrocession passed with no African Americans voting, the black community's reaction was despair. One abolitionist later wrote that, as the votes were announced every quarter of an hour, the suppressed wailings and lamentations of the people of color were constantly ascending to God for help and succor, in this, the hour of their need. They were right to despair. In the district, they had protections for freedom of worship, and several schools existed to teach African Americans. As a part of Virginia, Alexandria shuttered black churches and schools. Another law required manumitted or free blacks to leave the state of Virginia within a year. The number of free blacks dropped precipitously in Alexandria in the 10 years after retrocession. What changed to make white Alexandrians go against their favored son, George Washington's clear preference for the city to be in the capital? The reasons Alexandrians and Congress gave were suspect. Congress argued that it didn't need the territory. Curious, a 100-square-mile capital is not large, and giving away more than a third of its land did not leave much room for future growth. By 1846, the United States had purchased the Louisiana Territory from France and annexed Texas. The Mexican-American War was well underway. The United States controlled more than twice the land it had in 1790 and had ambitions to dominate the continent. Surely it would need a capital to control this vast swath of land. Congress's other reason for retrocession was equally suspicious. The people of Alexandria were deprived of the rights of citizenship because the district's white men had no representation. True, but those north of the Potomac on the Maryland side also lacked the right to vote. In Alexandria, the white elite had seen their fortunes ebb. In 1790, they hoped their port town would rival Baltimore or Richmond. That dream died, and so too did their visions of an agricultural paradise. Overfarming of tobacco and wheat depleted the soil and led many to abandon northern Virginia for more fertile territory south and west. With less farming, Maryland, the district, and northern Virginia had a surplus of enslaved labor. Farther south, the thirst for slaves was all but unquenchable. Cotton became the cash crop, especially after the invention and continued improvement of the mechanical cotton gin, which more easily separated seeds from the fiber. Cotton production went from 200,000 bales in 1815 to 3.8 million bales in 1860. The gin meant more enslaved labor picked cotton rather than separated it, making the crop far more lucrative for landowners. With mechanical gins and acres of cotton, plantation owners became some of the wealthiest men in North America, but they needed more enslaved labor. Alexandria became a lucrative slave trading town, one of the biggest in the country. Slave dealers bought the enslaved from local farmers and then resold people to the newly settled cotton growers in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. In 1834, one of the largest slave trading companies in the country, Franklin and Armfield, owned a huge slave prison in Alexandria, from where they shipped between 1,500 and 2,000 enslaved people to the Deep South a year. Starting in the 1830s, the slavers began to worry about abolitionists. The American Anti-Slavery Society campaigned to force Congress to end slavery and especially the slave trade in the District of Columbia. Congress had complete control over the district, making it vulnerable to anti-slavery attacks. Broadsides showcased the evil of the man trade in the metropolis of liberty, calling the buying and selling of humans an outrage upon public sentiment made worse by the use of federal tax dollars. One pamphlet decried slavery and the slave trade in the nation's capital in defiance of God's commands and in violation of our own fundamental national law. The most logical explanation for retrocession was to protect slavery, but the people of Alexandria and the pro-slavery forces in Congress hid their tracks. The two leaders of the legislation in Congress, John Calhoun of South Carolina in the Senate and R.M.T. Hunter of Virginia in the House, were both staunch advocates of slavery. Only 4 years after Alexandria rejoined Virginia, Congress outlawed the slave trade, but not slavery itself, in the District of Columbia. In the Compromise of 1850, the last successful attempt to keep the country together before the Civil War, Henry Clay, the senator from Kentucky, offered the northern states a prize: cessation of the slave trade in the district. Clay hoped that banning the slave trade would appease abolitionists. One pro-slavery paper, The Republic, supported the bill to mitigate abolitionists' anger, arguing that Northerners knew nothing of the comfort or content of the slave. All knew that Alexandria was just across the river and could easily absorb any slave trading from the city of Washington. In fact, Alexandria profited handsomely from the outlawing of slavery in the district, becoming a major enslaved warehouse during the 1850s. After the 1850 law, Alexandria became even more enmeshed with the slave trade. Everyone benefited from the new trade, except, of course, the enslaved. The odious nature of the slave trade revealed itself in the local papers. During the summer of 1860, a Georgetown slave owner sold Sarah Miranda Plummer to a slave trader in Alexandria. He kept her in the notorious slave pens 2 months, waiting for the best price before moving her to New Orleans for resale. Sarah couldn't tell her family goodbye in person because her mother was on a farm near Baltimore and the plantation where her father was enslaved was in Hyattsville. Sarah likely moved to the Alexandria pen in a coffle, a line of humans chained to one another by their hands and feet. Growing up in the South, I never heard the word coffle. The Alexandria Gazette described how the children and some of the women are generally crowded into a cart or wagon, while others follow on foot, frequently handcuffed and chained together. The slavers drove their human cargo many miles in coffles to the overcrowded and fetid slave pens. The Gazette noted that scarcely a week passes without some of these wretched creatures being driven through our streets. Alexandria became infamous for its numerous enslaved prisons, some of them within blocks of Robert E. Lee's boyhood home. Many hotels converted their rooms into slave cells to keep up with demand. For the enslaved, the new economic landscape meant a dread fear of families being broken apart and each person being sold separately, often hundreds, even thousands of miles apart. And they knew where they were going: the plantations of the Deep South. No, I will not call them plantations and evoke an image of hooped-skirt ladies sipping iced tea on the veranda while the wind whispers through the Spanish moss. I will use a more appropriate term: enslaved labor farms. When I lived in Alexandria, I never knew the retrocession story. During my childhood, no monument, no plaque reminded Alexandrians of its central role in the slave trade. Instead, the Confederate soldier proudly stood sentinel on Prince Street. As a child, I never heard stories about Alexandria's role in the Civil War either, and for good reason. The Battle of Alexandria featured no Confederate heroics. In fact, Alexandria had less than 24 hours under the Confederate flag. On May 23, 1861, Virginians held a referendum to approve the state's secession from the Union. In Alexandria, a secessionist stronghold, the vote reflected the white citizens' overwhelming desire to leave the United States, 958 to 48. With the secession vote counted, Virginia joined its slaveholding sister states in rebellion. That evening, Lincoln ordered General Irwin McDowell, West Point class of 1838, to seize Alexandria. Under the cover of darkness, McDowell ordered a three-pronged assault. Infantry silently trooped across the Long Bridge, 4 miles north of Alexandria, into the secessionist territory. Farther upstream, U.S. cavalry crossed Chain Bridge. A smaller amphibious force landed directly on the Alexandria waterfront. Confederate skirmishers fired a few shots into the air and then skedaddled south. One Union soldier described the Confederates' retreat, saying it was as if the devil himself had been after them with a particularly sharp stick. The Battle of Alexandria was over, and the city would stay under U.S. control for the rest of the war. The Confederates in my hometown gave up without a fight. Almost. The first U.S. Army officer killed in the Civil War died in Alexandria on May 24, 1861, and it was closer to murder than war. As the U.S. soldiers began to occupy my hometown, the most conspicuous sign of secession fluttered from the rooftop of the Marshall House Inn. The massive Confederate flag, 8 by 16 feet, on a 40-foot staff, was visible by spyglass from the White House. The inn's owner, James Jackson, was an ardent secessionist and fierce defender of slavery, who had a reputation for violence. Once, when a Catholic priest had upset him, Jackson beat the man senseless. Jackson itched to show his secessionist credentials after just missing the fight against John Brown's ragtag militia at Harper's Ferry 2 years earlier. Instead of glory, Jackson brought home a withered chunk of human ear, which he claimed had once been attached to John Brown's son. Leading the assault into Alexandria was the 11th New York Volunteer Infantry Zouaves, commanded by Captain Elmer Ellsworth, a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln's. Ellsworth dressed the 11th New York in their foppish French-Algerian-inspired uniform, with baggy pants, open red jacket, spats, and a fez. The sharp-dressed Zouaves expected a fight, but found none. As Ellsworth led a small group of soldiers through Alexandria's streets, he spied the Marshall House's enormous rebel flag flying. Crying out, "That flag must come down," Ellsworth double-timed into the inn and clambered up the stairs, cutting the flag from its staff. As he descended the stairs with the flag draped around his neck, he met the hotel's owner. Jackson leveled a double-barreled shotgun at point-blank range into Ellsworth's chest and pulled the trigger. Ellsworth fell the last 2 steps, mortally wounded. Jackson's neck shot missed Private Frank Brownell, and Brownell responded with a .58 caliber rifled musket shot into Jackson's face, followed by repeated bayonet thrusts to Jackson's lifeless body. Brownell's rifle featured a 26-inch curved saber bayonet, creating a lance 6.5 feet long. Brownell would later telegraph his parents in upstate New York, "Father, Colonel Ellsworth was shot dead this morning. I killed his murderer, Frank." As word reached Washington, the city keened. Ellsworth's friend, President Lincoln, was so distraught he burst into tears during a meeting with a senator. Lincoln said, "I will make no apology, gentlemen, for my weakness, but I knew poor Ellsworth well and held him in great regard." As Ellsworth's body lay in state in the White House, the president stopped at the coffin, and those around him could hear his wail, my boy, was it necessary this sacrifice be made?" The United States had its first martyred hero, shot down like a dog, in Alexandria. At his funeral, Edward L. Cole contrasted Ellsworth and Jackson, the one dying in defense of the principles of human freedom, the other dying the death of a traitor, his name given an infamous notoriety by the cowardly Assassin Act. Before Ellsworth's murder, Northern public opinion looked at the secessionists more like wayward brothers enticed by radicals. No more. "Remember Ellsworth" became a rallying cry for the rest of the war. Another regiment, the 44th New York, became known as Ellsworth's Avengers. It would take 4 years of war and hundreds of thousands of battlefield deaths before another, more important martyr, Lincoln, superseded Ellsworth as the most important single U.S. death during the Civil War. In his honor, the U.S. Army built Fort Ellsworth in Alexandria. Today, the George Washington Masonic Temple sits on that site. At the top of the monument, the old star-shaped fort was still visible, but in 1974, the Fort Ellsworth condominiums obliterated the last remnants of its namesake. If the United States had a martyr, so too did the white citizens of the South, especially Virginians, who greeted James Jackson's death with their own bloodlust. The next day, the Richmond Examiner gloated about Ellsworth's death. Virginians, Arise in strength and welcome the invader with bloody hands to hospitable graves. The Richmond Whig whipped up its readers. Let their accursed blood manure our fields. And the name of Jackson shall be enshrined in the heart of Virginia. The paper later advertised a memorial volume called Life of James W. Jackson, the Alexandria Hero, the Slayer of Ellsworth, the first martyr in the cause of Southern independence. When I was growing up in Alexandria, I didn't know the story of Ellsworth and Jackson, but if I had looked, I would have found that Alexandria made the murderer Jackson the hero. In 1900, the city added Jackson's name to the Prince Street Monument, 11 years after the other names, even though he was no soldier. About 2 miles from my house, the Sons and Daughters of Confederate Veterans created a plaque in 1929 to the first martyr to the cause of Southern independence. He laid down his life in defense of his home and the sacred soil of Virginia. That's the Virginia I knew. I shouldn't feel surprised, but I always do. I found so many plaques, monuments, and memorials that support white supremacy. Each one contributes to the stories and myths of my life. Down is up, bad is good. White Virginians worked hard to feel good about slavery and segregation. In my Alexandria, history's hero was James Jackson. Today, thank goodness, times are changing. In response to the white supremacist violence in Charlottesville, the Marriott hotel chain, the new owners of the building, removed the plaque in 2017, giving it to the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Fearful of any publicity, Marriott refused to take credit for displacing the plaque. Ellsworth and Jackson were probably the last two people killed in anger in my hometown during the entire Civil War. If Alexandria missed the destructive fighting that much of Virginia suffered, it did have a new issue. Safely behind U.S. Army lines, Alexandria became a destination for escaped slaves. Here was yet another story hidden from me while growing up in Alexandria. African Americans flocked to safety in Alexandria, where they found employment in the war economy. Almost 20,000 African Americans were living in the city by 1865, a nearly tenfold increase. The huge influx created a refugee crisis. Segregated into hastily assembled shantytowns, the freedmen, and especially their children, were susceptible to camp diseases like dysentery, typhus, and smallpox that killed so many soldiers on both sides. The number of deaths overwhelmed the city's ability to bury the dead. In 1864, with the cemeteries full, the federal government seized property on the corner of Washington and Church Streets for a freedmen's burial ground. By 1869, more than 1,800 freedmen had found their final resting place at the cemetery. More than half of those buried were children. But the African American cemetery did not receive the same care as the white National Cemetery. After the war, the government maintained the cemetery for a decade or so, but soon the wooden markers rotted away and everyone forgot that the site was a cemetery. By the time I was born, a service station desecrated the land with a 3,000-gallon underground gas tank. Finally, in 1987, a local historian found an 1894 article from the Washington Post describing a graveyard containing defunct colored people that was being washed away by the rains, and those not washed into the Potomac were ground into fertilizer. Over the last 30 years, extensive archaeological digs and archival research have identified the cemetery, demolished the gas station, and created a stunning memorial on that location. I visited the park recently, and it filled me with hope. When we identify our history, we can change the narrative. When I talk about the Civil War or Confederate monuments, I hear complaints that I'm trying to change history. Is the new memorial in Alexandria changing history or correcting history? Yes to both. It's recovering a story lost and creating a more accurate portrayal of the past. History is always changing. We link the past to our conception of the present, and we always have. I want to change history because as a child in Alexandria, I never understood the repugnant nature of slavery or the powerful history of African Americans in my city. Little wonder I grew up revering the Confederacy. My hometown revered it as well, and it either forgot or refused to honor the legacy of African Americans who lived in Alexandria. As I looked at the history of Alexandria, I found amazing stories detailing African American contributions to the city. Every society needs heroes, but my Alexandria made Lee the slave owner, Lee the rebel, Lee the general, the greatest man. Now, as a historian and an army officer, I found new heroes. In Alexandria, my hero is Samuel Tucker, an African-American lawyer born in 1913 who helped destroy the apartheid racial system in Virginia and the nation. As a child, he remembered his grandfather talking about the time before they Jim Crowed us. As Tucker said, "At an early age, I knew it had not always been this way. Segregation was not God-ordained." He was right. Jim Crow laws solidified segregation in the 1890s. As a teenager growing up in Alexandria in the 1920s, Tucker had to walk 22 blocks to catch a streetcar for a long trip across the Potomac into Washington because Alexandria had no high school for black children. He said that in high school, he bootlegged an education. Later, he would recall his childhood experience with the Jim Crow system. That was the first kind of scar. We knew something was wrong with it. There was a white public high school within sight of my home. After high school, Tucker went to Howard University. After his college graduation, he knew he wanted to practice law, but no white law school would accept him. Undeterred, he passed the bar exam before his 21st birthday. By his 25th birthday, Tucker had started a long campaign to kill Jim Crow segregation. He first targeted the new Alexandria Public Library, which opened in 1937, only 2 blocks from his home. The library refused to issue him or a black veteran a borrower's card, despite the city taxes they paid. Moreover, the city allowed white non-residents to use the library for a small yearly fee. Tucker created a plan that would become famous 2 decades later at the Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and cities throughout the South in 1960. He recruited 5 young black men to enter the library sequentially. Each man asked for a library card. When the librarian refused, declaring only white people had access, the men went to shelves, selected a book, sat down, and started reading. Tucker made sure that each person took a seat at a separate table so there was no possibility that chatter would be construed as disturbing the peace. While the men sat peaceably, a 14-year-old boy ran from the library to Tucker's office to describe the unfolding events. The librarian asked the men to leave and threatened to call the police if they did not. One man gave the response for all, "Well, we are staying." When the police escorted the men outside the library, they found 200 or 300 people waiting, including reporters and photographers. Wisely, Tucker ensured the incident received as much publicity as possible. As he prepared for white Alexandrians' response, he knew the men had broken no state laws. Virginia's 1926 Public Assemblages Act mandated only that races be segregated within a building. The event flummoxed Alexandria's white leaders because they couldn't imagine the black populace would protest or, when they did, that it would be so brilliantly executed. As Tucker later said, city officials didn't know what in the world to do. He knew the law better than the authorities. After hours of indecision, the city manager finally ordered police to charge the 5 men with disturbing the peace, even though the police acknowledged no peace was disturbed. Tucker cut to the real issue. They were disorderly because they were black. The white city leaders described Tucker and his team as overzealous because they went outside the segregation system by protesting in the library rather than going through the proper authorities. When the case went to trial, the city attorney, Armistead Booth, argued, with much embarrassment, that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which guaranteed equal protection and due process, had been forced upon Virginia. Therefore, the U.S. Constitution did not apply to the Old Dominion. Tucker had attacked segregation in Alexandria head-on and forced the city's leaders to confess that Jim Crow had a dubious legal standing. In the short run, Tucker lost his fight to end segregation in Alexandria, but he put up a fight I knew nothing about. Most histories talk about the civil rights movement starting in the 1950s. Lately, more historians are talking of a long civil rights movement that started much earlier. Samuel Tucker, from my hometown, demanded an end to Jim Crow laws in the 1930s as a 20-something. He should have been a hero for me and every child in Alexandria. With World War II bearing down, the Alexandria Public Library sit-in, as the newspapers called it, was lost on the public trying to deal with the coming conflagration. Tucker joined the Army and became an officer in the 366th Infantry Regiment, one of the few segregated units with black officers. He saw combat in Italy, rising to the rank of major. After serving in the Jim Crow Army during the war, Tucker returned to the United States. He became even more determined to combat the racial police state in Virginia. Convinced there were too many lawyers in Alexandria, he moved further south to Emporia, the heart of Virginia's Black Belt, where African Americans formed a greater percentage of the population but had even less power. With no black judges, lawyers, or jurors, African Americans' only role in the judicial system was as defendants. Tucker became such a thorn in the side of the white apartheid community that he feared for his family's safety and moved out of town, building a house with 2 doors to each room to prevent his family from being trapped. The white powers were right to fear him. He eventually became the lead attorney for the NAACP, challenging segregation in Virginia, filing suit in Alexandria and nearly 50 other counties and cities to force white officials to obey the landmark federal court cases like Brown versus the Board of Education. Samuel Tucker should have been my hero. Instead, I worshiped Lee and his Confederate colleagues. As Tucker fought for equality, Alexandria doubled down on memorializing Confederates. The city passed a law in 1953 requiring all new street names that ran north and south to honor Confederates. The timing of the change was no accident. In 1953, a court case challenging a segregated school in Farmville, Virginia, was working its way up through the federal court system. Eventually, it would be one of the 5 cases that became Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, the name of the Supreme Court case that overturned the legality of a segregated school system. Only in 2014 did the Alexandria City Council finally repeal the law, but not before the city named up to 66 streets after Confederates. Alexandria has more than twice as many things named for Confederates as the next leading Virginia city, the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond. My hometown wanted to prove it was Southern and against civil rights. No better way to prove its white Southern bona fides than by memorializing its hometown heroes, Robert E. Lee and other Confederates. The city council chambers featured a late 19th century portrait of Lee donated by the United Daughters of the Confederacy and emplaced in 1964. Again and again, memorials to Lee and the Confederates would reappear when African Americans demanded, and especially when they succeeded, in furthering civil rights. Next to the portrait, a placard quoted a letter Lee wrote to his friends in 1870 as they tried to raise money to rebuild the city. There is no community to which my affections more strongly cling than that of Alexandria, composed of my earliest and oldest friends, my schoolfellows, and faithful neighbors. That's the Alexandria I knew, one that highlighted its ties to Lee and the Confederates. My first school, Douglas MacArthur Elementary, was on Janney's Lane, named for Major Eli Janney, a Confederate quartermaster officer on Lee's staff. MacArthur Elementary was an all-white school built during World War II to support the huge influx of men and women working for the federal government and building the Pentagon. I knew MacArthur was a heroic general, but I remember little about the curriculum. As I researched why Lee and the Confederacy had such a hold on me as a child, I found another insidious way the state inculcated the lost cause myth: Virginia history textbooks. The state created textbooks for the 4th, 7th, and 11th grades to use history to teach us the Virginia way of life. I certainly had the 4th grade book. Schools continued to use these textbooks through the 1970s. Virginia History, Government, and Geography, the 7th grade book, featured a chapter titled How the Negroes Lived Under Slavery. The cover illustration for the chapter went beyond bad history into farce. Stage right, a dignified man in colonial attire with top hat, long coat, and striped trousers, shows that he is an educated Christian gentleman. He shakes hands while his left hand grips the other man's shoulder. Clearly there is a bond here as the gentleman steps toward the man as if to welcome him. The other man is dressed in a suit as well, with a traveling bag at his side. The center of the illustration shows a well-appointed family. A young boy of 8 or 9, holding a hat, stands close to his father. An older, well-dressed teenage boy carries a knapsack and looks at the two men shaking hands with obvious respect. Stage left, the man's 2 smartly dressed daughters stand next to their mother. A huge bonnet covers the mother's entire head as she holds a handkerchief to her face, overcome by emotion, as if to say, finally, we have arrived, and this gentleman will make our long journey worth the trip. The dapper family, husband, wife, and 4 children, look as though they completed a family holiday on a princess cruise ship. In reality, the African family crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a slave ship, the infamous Middle Passage. Unlike the fantasy portrayed in the Virginia history textbook, the enslaved suffered about a 15% mortality rate from disease, suffocation, execution, or suicide. One contemporary writer described going into the hold where the Africans were held. It was only about 4.5 feet tall. So close and foul was the stench, some enslaved Africans have been known to be put down the hold strong and healthy at night and have been dead in the morning. According to my textbook, the white gentleman just purchased the African family, and they eagerly await bondage, not only for the rest of their lives, but for their children's and grandchildren's lives, perpetual enslavement. The illustration portrays a ghastly fantasy, really a nightmare, that the family will work hard for free for eternity, and in exchange the slave owner will care for the family for the rest of their lives. As another one of the trio of history books told young Virginians, the African family begins their enslavement in a system similar to comprehensive Social Security. I read through the Virginia history textbook with disbelief, followed by profound anger. I checked the publishing data. First edition, 1957. Second edition, and the one I read, 1964. All the lies of the lost cause myth in one convenient package to inculcate Virginia children, like me, with the same racist ideology. States' rights and tariffs as the cause of the Civil War. Slavery as a positive good. The war between the states, not the Civil War. The evils of Reconstruction. The heroism of the Confederate soldier. The righteousness of the cause. The godliness of the Virginia way of life. And, of course, Lee as God. No mention in the book of Harriet Tubman, who led many enslaved people to freedom. No mention of Samuel Tucker. I expected all that. But the way the text dealt with slavery was the most preposterous and the most chilling. The 7th grade textbook stated that life among the Negroes of Virginia in slavery times was generally happy. The authors explained why. In Africa, they had known a form of slavery more stern than that of Virginia plantations. Therefore, the Negroes learned also to enjoy the work of the plantation. Slavery worked for everyone because a strong tie existed between slave and master because each was dependent on the other. The master needed the work and loyalty of his slaves. The slave was dependent for all his needs on the master. Reading these lies, I felt as if the author were channeling Margaret Mitchell from Gone with the Wind. How did the textbook authors deal with the problems of slavery, like the lash? In those days, whipping was the usual method for correcting children. The planter looked upon his slaves as children and punished them as such. Whipping, the authors argued, was family discipline from a well-intentioned father. Despite whipping, a feeling of strong affection existed between masters and slaves in Virginia. How about the awful practice of splitting families and selling children out of state to receive the highest price on the auction block? The book argued that Virginia plantation owners didn't want to split families, but had no choice because of hard economic times. Moreover, the enslaved sold to the Deep South away from their loved ones were unhappy because they had to leave their beloved Virginia. Negroes did not wish to leave their old masters. As a school kid in Virginia, I never received an honest accounting of slavery. Many historians have now given us a clear look at the slave trade, plantation life, that is, life on the enslaved labor farms, and slave rebellions. Every aspect of slavery was just as evil as the abolitionists and the peerlessly honest former slave Frederick Douglass described it. If anything, the conditions were worse. The only way to argue for slavery then or now is to believe that the enslaved weren't real human beings, that the lives of those who had darker skin had less worth, that the color of skin meant the difference between human and not quite human. And that is the hideous lesson my Virginia history textbook taught school children in the Old Dominion. The Virginia legislature created a textbook commission in response to what it considered a shocking development. In 1947, President Harry S. Truman's Committee on Civil Rights horrified white Virginia politicians with a simple statement recommending the elimination of segregation based on race, color, creed, or national origin from American life. For the Virginia legislature, controlled by the ultra-conservative political machine led by the Democrat Harry F. Byrd, the commission's charge to eliminate segregation was a call to arms. Starting in 1948, the General Assembly created a commission led by a prominent segregationist to study what children learned about the state's history. The answer: young Virginians' education failed to provide a strong historical foundation for white supremacy. The General Assembly then created a textbook commission to write and publish 3 textbooks for use in every public school in the state. The purpose of the textbooks went beyond facts. The commissioners hoped to instill in school children's hearts and minds a greater love of Virginia and a perpetuation of her ideals. The textbook commission wanted their selected authors to capture the genteel tradition of the Old Dominion known as the Virginia spirit. While the commission never explicitly defined it, one member emphasized the generous and kindly traits in the Virginia spirit. I understood. The commission wanted to create educated Christian ladies and gentlemen who looked at history from a positive point of view without being boastful. The commission told the authors to emphasize Virginia's right to secede. Above all, avoid critiquing slavery. Is the matter of slavery presented in the very ablest and best light? They asked. The commissioners directed that the textbook authors not give the impression that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. While the books created an imaginary past, the legislature set its eyes firmly on present difficulties. In 1954, while the authors wrote, the Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, outlawing school segregation. The Democratic Byrd machine's reaction was to lead not only Virginia, but the entire white South in a massive resistance campaign against integration. The textbook's treatment of the Civil War offered contemporary lessons to all Virginia's children, black and white. In the antebellum era, they argued, slavery was positive for both master and slave. In the 1950s, segregation was also a net positive for both races. From the Commission's point of view, during the war between the states, Virginia fought bravely against federal overreach and for the state's rights even after the cause was lost. In the 1950s, Virginians should also fight against the imposition of federal overreach on the state's rights and institutions. The United States hoped to nullify the Virginia way of life. Virginia should fight and fight to the bitter end, even if the cause was lost. Several groups protested against these textbooks. The All-Black Virginia Teachers Association wrote in 1964, "This is not objective history. It is Virginia's history as a white Virginian sees it, or rather, as he would like to keep it." By 1972, the text had become an embarrassment to the state. The Virginia Council for the Social Studies, representing teachers who used the books in the classrooms, called the text ridiculous and reprehensible. Although not everyone was on board, Francis Butler Simpkins, a professor at Longwood College in Farmville, Virginia, and president of the Southern Historical Association, wrote the 7th grade book. He refused to back down, writing that slavery did not create a second heaven, but it did bring the Negro barbarian into the circle of American civilization. In 1972, my 5th grade year, the State Board of Education announced that the Virginia histories were decommissioned, or as one reporter wrote, thrown in the trash basket. Governor Linwood Holton, the first Republican to serve as Virginia governor since Reconstruction, tried to have them immediately removed, but he ran into opposition in the legislature and backed down. The books continued to be used at least through the late 1970s. The Virginia textbooks formed one of the most powerful testaments to white supremacy, an insidious monument that poisoned children's minds for a generation. Massive resistance to school desegregation led to the Virginia history textbooks and their despicable description of slavery. Yet by the time I entered kindergarten, massive resistance to integration had mainly failed. The Byrd machine ran on white votes, especially in the southern arc of the state. When Virginia created a new constitution after Reconstruction, it ratified a poll tax to disenfranchise African Americans. White Virginians boldly stated their purpose. State Senator Carter Glass exclaimed, "Discrimination? Why, that is precisely what we propose. That exactly is what this convention was elected for, to discriminate with a view to the elimination of every Negro voter who can be gotten rid of." When African Americans began to vote with the help of federal court decisions, the Byrd machine's power started to wane. That's why they saw integration as such a threat. The courts would give everyone the ballot, and the white supremacists' hold on elected office would weaken. As a kid attending Alexandria Public Schools in the 1970s, I dealt with integration, not massive resistance. In the fall of 1973, I was bused from all-white MacArthur Elementary on the west side of town to a school that was more than 85% African American in the southeast part of Alexandria. What was the name of the nearly segregated black school, named in 1961, that I attended in the 6th grade? Robert E. Lee Elementary School. As a child, I did not understand the cruel irony of naming a predominantly African American school after a Confederate icon who fought to create a slave republic. The story of how I ended up attending Lee Elementary School shows Virginia's extensive efforts to maintain white supremacy until the federal courts forced it to change. When the Supreme Court issued its decision in Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, it overturned one aspect of the carefully constructed system of the racial police state in the South. Virginia did not accept the Supreme Court's decision. Initially, the Virginia governor, Lindsey Almond, counseled moderation, but the U.S. Senator Harry Byrd, who controlled Virginia politics with an iron fist, reacted with fury when he heard Almond would acquiesce to the highest court in the land. The top blew off the U.S. Capitol, Almond recalled. Byrd announced that the state's strategy in 1956, if we can organize the southern states for massive resistance to this order, the rest of the country will realize that racial integration is not going to be accepted in the South. Almond was soon on board, declaring, We will oppose with every facility at our command and with every ounce of our energy the attempt being made to mix the white and Negro races in our classrooms. Virginia followed that pronouncement with laws to back up its position, ordering schools to shutter rather than integrate. In 1958, Charlottesville and Norfolk schools, as well as those in Prince Edward and Warren counties, closed by order of the governor. Thousands of school children went without education for half a decade, so Virginia could, once again, maintain its racial code. The General Assembly also created a voucher system using public funds to allow white parents to send their children to private schools. The federal courts ruled the closures and the vouchers unconstitutional, but Harry Byrd would not give up. He tried to persuade Governor Allman to call out the National Guard. One unverified account of that meeting suggests Byrd ordered Allman to shoot children if necessary. Allman allegedly replied, "I'll do it, Harry, if you put it in writing." White supremacists rarely give up their power without a fight. Allman finally relented, and token integration began peacefully in February 1959. Alexandria was Northern Virginia's only outpost for the Byrd machine. Byrd's cousin was the mayor in the mid-1950s, and the city maintained the ideology of white supremacy. The Washington Post called Alexandria in 1957 Northern Virginia's last stronghold of conservatism, when conservatism meant racism. By 1958, the city's leaders felt minimal accommodation was a better strategy than Byrd's massive resistance, but it was for purely strategic reasons. The state senator, Armistead Booth, represented Alexandria in the state legislature and believed in a mildly reformist agenda that earned him the enmity of the Byrd machine, but he was still a white supremacist. In a letter to a friend, he wrote that while there were extraordinary individual African Americans, the Negro race as a race is very inferior to the white race. Publicly, he told the Kiwanis Club in 1959, "I am a Southerner, born and bred. As a result, I am a segregationist. I am not a degradationist. I have not, I do not, and shall not degrade every single American citizen who is born a Negro." Yet Booth believed that compelling Virginians to desegregate schools would be the keynote to tragedy. Booth had previously served as a prosecutor against the men who tried to integrate the Alexandria Public Library in the 1930s. To obey the letter, if not the spirit, of the Supreme Court decision, Virginia passed the Pupil Placement Law in 1956. The law allowed African American parents to petition the school board to admit their children to white schools, but the board found bigoted reasons to refuse admittance without mentioning race. It allowed schools to integrate only by court order and then on an individual child basis. Whether called pupil placement or freedom of choice, Virginia's reaction to forced integration was tokenism, which limited desegregation. Leading the fight against the state's plans to create segregation by another name was none other than Samuel Tucker, who at one time had 150 civil rights cases before state and federal courts. Alexandria began to change to a new gradualist position in 1963 that would allow African American children to go to their neighborhood schools while accepting residential segregation. The gradualist position held sway until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, especially Title VI of that law, which prevented any federal money from going to an organization that discriminated on the basis of race. Alexandria's new school superintendent, John Albom, bragged that Alexandria was the first city in the state to meet the new standard. But with the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965, the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW, took over the enforcement of integration from the court system. In Alexandria, the problem was residential segregation. On the west side of town where I lived, the neighborhoods were lily white. In Old Town Alexandria, middle-class African-American families had started moving out to avoid the poor school districts and endemic poverty. Alexandria refused to take on the residential problem to change the school districts. The superintendent said, "The school board's primary concern is education, not gerrymandering school districts to balance the white-Negro student ratio." True enough, MacArthur Elementary, where I went to kindergarten in the summer of 1967, was 100% white, while Charles Houston Elementary was 100% African American. Alexandria's problem was in elementary schools, but it chose to solve the problem in the high schools because it was more politically feasible. The city's solution became famous. In 1971, the city consolidated its 3 high schools. The predominantly African-American high school, George Washington, became the school for all 9th graders. The 10th graders went to Francis C. Hammond, and the juniors and seniors went to T.C. Williams High School, across the street from me on Quaker Lane. The namesake of the school, T.C. Williams, was the longtime school superintendent. While he did manage the growth during the World War II boom years, he was an ardent segregationist. I knew about the city's creation of a new school only because T.C. Williams became a football powerhouse in 1971. In 2000, the school became world-renowned when Denzel Washington played Herman Boone, T.C. Williams' coach, in the movie Remember the Titans. The Titans won the state football championship that year. I remember that season because my dad was the head football coach at Episcopal High School and knew the white coach, Bill Yost, who became Boone's assistant coach. When city leaders created a single high school for the 11th and 12th grades, they were well aware of the potential to become a sports powerhouse, another possible way to unite the racially divided town. The plan to create one high school was a brilliant solution to bring white and black together in Alexandria high schools. Unfortunately, it didn't solve the problems identified by the Office for Civil Rights at HEW. The elementary schools, like the one I went to, remained completely segregated. The only way to solve that problem was to resort to busing. Alexandria fought it for as long as it could, but in the fall of 1973 it submitted. The day after Labor Day, I waited to take a bus to school for the first time. I was so excited to go to a school named after my hero, Robert E. Lee. Alexandria's plan was to pair schools like the all-white MacArthur with the predominantly African-American Lee. White parents, angry with the desegregation plan, burned crosses on some school campuses. That year, Lee Elementary suffered through several bomb scares. But I liked the bomb threats for the extra recess time they created. During my year at Lee Elementary School, I ran for class president and lost with only 40% of the vote, the exact percentage of white kids in the school. Yet I also had an African-American teacher and principal for the first and last time. Alexandria, like so many cities, became a cauldron of racial violence as the evils of Jim Crow lifted, but equal opportunity did not follow. African-American citizens would no longer accept violence to enforce racial control. In 1970, Robin Gibson, an African-American high school student, walked into a 7-Eleven in the Arlandria area of the city. John Hanna, the white store manager, accused the student of shoplifting. The situation escalated, and the manager shot the student in the neck, killing him. In an attempt to frame the young man, Hanna placed a knife near Gibson's body as he lay dying. The city exploded with 7 nights of firebombings, destruction of cars, and vandalism protesting the killing. Alexandria's leaders then made it worse as the chief of police, Russell Hawes, told the Washington Post, "We usually don't have too much trouble with the colored." Hanna's murder trial confirmed the feelings of the African-American community. 12 white jurors failed to reach a decision because one juror would not convict under any circumstances. As one black activist told the Washington Post, there was no chance a white judge and a white jury in a courtroom decorated with a Confederate flag will give the same kind of justice to a white defendant that they would give to a black one in the same case. Eventually, the defendant pleaded guilty to manslaughter and served 6 months in jail before he was paroled. In a packed church after the verdict, the pastor, Samuel Neesmith, told the crowd that Hanna's short jail term was a blow to the dignity and pride of a free society, especially black Alexandrians. Then he got real. Quote, "This is how Alexandria became an all-American city, by keeping niggers in their place," unquote. When Neesmith sat, student leaders took his place in the pulpit. The president of George Washington High School's sophomore class told the audience, "The so-called Christian white people who push the blacks aside in this city are going straight to hell." The audience responded with a standing ovation. The state's attorney defended his plea deal agreement when he met with 250 members of a youth group. "You know perfectly well that this was the most vigorous prosecution of a white defendant accused of killing a black man ever to take place in this courthouse." A true statement that made the situation even worse. White parents began to protest vigorously about the decline in discipline throughout the public school system, especially in the middle schools. I joined the huge number of white parents and kids who reacted to the discipline problem, code for integration, by fleeing the public schools. Rather than going to the mini Howard Middle School, less than a quarter mile from my home across Braddock Road, I was sent to St. Stephen's School for 7th grade. I became part of the white flight from public schools. With whites leaving, Alexandria became more diverse, and eventually a coalition of more liberal whites and African Americans began to run the city. Alexandria, in fact, started to become a Washington suburb and lost much of its Old South ideology. The conservative town that I knew grew into a more diverse and inclusive city, but the process was painful, and it wasn't long before many of the schools resegregated as the federal government lost its appetite to enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Alexandria was the place that set my Southern character and caused my wife amusement and consternation. Steeped in Old South nostalgia and racism, Alexandria inculcated me into the cult of the Confederacy. Almost from the cradle, I learned to worship the gentleman in gray, especially Robert E. Lee. I knew what I wanted to be, an educated Christian gentleman, a Virginia gentleman. Every part of my childhood worshiped the 4 years of Confederate rule, even though Alexandria actually spent all but a few hours under U.S. control. In the aftermath of the war, Virginia led the South in creating and maintaining a police state based on racial control. Today, the more I learn about segregation and the Jim Crow system in Virginia, the more I agree with the great Virginia civil rights lawyer Oliver W. Hill Sr., a law partner with Samuel Tucker. Hill found a better way to explain the Virginia way of life that helped form me. In 1985, he described life for Southern African American citizens during the Jim Crow era. Virginia and the whole South were police states. There isn't a question about that. Negroes didn't serve on juries. You saw no blacks in places like City Hall or public buildings, except maybe an elevator operator or janitor, and that's the way it was. If the Virginia of my youth was no democracy, if I call a plantation an enslaved labor farm, then I should call segregated Virginia by its true name, a racial police state. To be clear, the South of my birth was no democracy. When I go back to Alexandria today, many parts of the city that glorify the Confederate cause have changed, but many remain the same, even after an exhaustive study. In 2015, the city stopped flying a Confederate flag to commemorate Lee's birthday and Confederate Memorial Day. Robert E. Lee Elementary School is gone. 2 miles from my old home, Samuel W. Tucker Elementary School educates white and black kids. Seeing Tucker Elementary School made me smile, but another school named for a Confederate, Matthew Morey, still exists. The city renamed Jefferson Davis Highway, but scores of street names, including Janney's Lane, still recognize Confederates. The segregated library Alexandria created to prevent Samuel Tucker from using the all-white library is now Alexandria's Black History Museum. The abandoned Civil War Black Cemetery has been reconsecrated with a haunting memorial about slavery just down the street from the Confederate monument and Lee's boyhood home. Maybe my wife is right. Alexandria might be a Washington suburb now, and that leaves me hopeful. Yet, My white Southern roots also know that beneath the veneer of civility lurks a dark past of slavery, segregation, and white supremacy. Maybe we were both right. Alexandria is both Southern and not so Southern, trying to shed its glorification of the Confederate cause incrementally. I understand. We find it hard to confront our past because it's so ugly. But the alternative to ignoring our racist history is creating a racist future.